Hello everyone! In these tutorials, I will show you how to sew a basic bustier corset with a sew-in cup. I attached a pattern made for the Russian size 44 or the American size 6 to these tutorials. I strongly recommend to all novices to start their exciting journey to the world of corsets with ready-made patterns. You should know how a corset is sewn before you can understand how its pattern is drafted. You are welcome to our training programs if you want to learn the drafting in detail. Now, let's get started. So, let's make our corset. First of all, print the pattern, which consists of 6 sheets. This pattern contains seam allowances. Now I will explain briefly where I provide for seam allowances on the corset pieces. Seam allowance comprises 1.2 centimeters along the upper and lower vertical curves of all the pieces. The cradle has seam allowance of 0.7 centimeters. Seam allowance of the main cup pieces, which are cut from the lining and lace, is also 0.7 centimeters. The upper cut of the cup has 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance for lining. There is no seam allowance for scalloped lace trims. I will explain that when cutting. The cup pieces, which we cut from neoprene, you can also use underwear foam, have seam allowances along the whole cradle line. Please note that the outer lower cup is absolutely similar to the respective piece from lace or lining. However, the inner lower cup, made of neoprene, has a slightly different shape. Seam allowance along the curve is cut off. The upper cup is also slightly changed. Seam allowance along the joining line of the upper and lower cup and along the upper edge of the piece is cut off. Now I'm going to tell you about materials and tools which we need. So, what materials do we need for the corset making? First of all, it is corset mesh. It is also called marquisette. It is sheer nylon mesh, which stretches slightly on the crosswise grain and it doesn't stretch on the lengthwise grain. We need about 0.5 meters of this mesh. Lace. There are no limitations here. You can choose any lace you like. It is desirable that it is thin and delicate. It is compulsory to have scalloped edge, as the corset cup will have protruding scallops. We will also need 0.5 meters of this lace. I will use neoprene for this cup. It is elastic fabric, which is about 2 millimeters thick, and it stretches in all directions. You can use underwear foam if neoprene is unavailable. We will need about 10 centimeters of this fabric. You can use any white fabric for lining. There are no limitations. You can use the leftovers or patches of any white fabric. You will need about 10 centimeters if you use a single piece of fabric. We will need about 2.5 meters of bone casing. It is the tape which is sold as bra accessories to insert metallic bones for cups. In addition, we will use this bone casing as tunnels for plastic bones. Of course, we will need 2 metallic bones of 36 size. We will also need about 20 centimeters of a hook and eye tape for fastening. I will use an elastic tape with scallops for finishing the upper edge of the corset. We will need about 0.5 meters of such tape. 2 centimeter wide tape is necessary to finish the corset bottom, which will also serve as a band. We will need 60 centimeters of such tape. And finally, we need 0.5 centimeter wide plastic bones. These bones are sold per meter, and we need about 2 meters. What tools do we need for our work? A sewing machine? An iron? It is possible to use a household iron. It is desirable to have a self-healing craft mat and a rotary cutter. The thing is that it is the most convenient to cut such corsets with a rotary cutter. However, if you don't have a mat and a cutter, you can use scissors. A cup pressing mold. It is a hemisphere with a diameter of 12 to 13 centimeters. It can be made of foam, wood, or plastic, covered with a layer of padding polyester, wrapped with threads, and glued with fusible interfacing. It is very easy to make it. Needles for hand stitching. Regular white threads, and pins. I recommend using a right erase pen or a disappearing ink pen for fabric marking. I use the pen Frixion by Pilot, which makes a 0.7 millimeter thick line. Such pens are better than disappearing ink pens, as their lines will disappear immediately when pressed with a hot iron. However, the marking made with a disappearing ink pen can leave yellow strips after pressing. Besides, the lines of the disappearing ink pen don't last for a long time. Let's get started with cutting. I fold the corset mesh, marquisette, in 2 layers and arrange all paper patterns except for the front central pattern, which will be cut open from 1 layered mesh. There are arrows on all the patterns, which indicate the most fabric stretchability. As I said, marquisette stretches slightly along its cut and it doesn't along the edge. So, I arrange the patterns according to the position of the arrows, which show the most stretchable direction. Thus, they are placed along the fabric cut. The fabric direction is crucial, as we don't want our corset to stretch in the waist. In general, corset making requires special attention. Please don't hurry and pin the paper patterns to mesh to ensure the least deformation. I recommend using a rotary cutter to achieve the highest level of accuracy. Moreover, I cut the pieces from a single fabric piece with larger seam allowance first, and only then I cut the pieces accurately according to the pattern. So I arranged and cut the pieces from the single piece of mesh. If you need to transfer additional marking lines or notches on the mesh piece, you should arrange the paper patterns face down to see through all necessary lines. This applies to the central and 2 front side pieces. I start cutting the front side pieces. You can cut on either side, right side or wrong side. It is up to you. Cut as accurately as possible. It is better to move the mat, not the pattern, when you are cutting. I use a right erase pen to transfer all necessary lines to the upper mesh layer, the position of the bone, the cup sewing line, and the notches. I will also transfer all the lines on the second lower mesh layer. I do the same with the front center piece. I apply the pattern to the surface and try to cut very precisely along the pattern. I move the mat when I need to move the pattern for easy cutting. Then I turn the piece over and transfer all the necessary lines. The position of the central bone, the notches, and the cup sewing line. You can also indicate the start and the end corners of the curve seam. I will cut all the pieces in an absolutely similar way. The back pieces are very simple and there are no additional lines, so it is easy to cut them from mesh. It is necessary to unpin the mesh pieces from the paper patterns and pin them together when you cut the mesh pieces off. Try not to shift the pieces along each other. I transfer the necessary lines on the second piece of the front side pieces. You can cut the corset pieces from mesh and lace together if your lace doesn't have a visible pattern, all in one go. However, my lace has a pattern, so I need to arrange the patterns so that the lace pattern repeats. I place lace facing up, pin the front central pattern, and cut off. Unfortunately, we don't need the scallops there. However, there are specific techniques when you can have the scalloped edge in the bottom. They are described in another course. By the way, if you want to continue learning and get access to dozens of courses and hundreds of tutorials, subscribe to our training programs. You can find all the details on our official website. The central front lace piece is cut off. After that, I fold the lace in 2 layers and try to ensure the lace pattern is similar as much as possible on both symmetric pieces and it coincides with the lace pattern on the front central piece. I cut off the front side lace pieces. I will do the same with the back. So the corset body is cut off. Let's move on to the cup cutting. We have 2 paper pattern sets for the cups. One set, on the right, is for cutting from lace and lining, and the second set, on the left, for cutting from neoprene or foam. I arrange the double-folded lining fabric so that the lengthwise grain runs on the right side of the cut and crosswise grain runs horizontally. I arrange the cup patterns accordingly so that the arrows on the patterns are parallel to crosswise grain. I cut off the lining pieces with larger seam allowance, and then I make a more accurate cutting. To avoid confusion when sewing, I transfer the joining number marks on each of the two symmetrical pieces and make notches. The lining pieces are cut off. I take the second set of the patterns and cut off the cups from neoprene. Lengthwise grain runs horizontally along the fabric fold. I arrange the arrows on the patterns perpendicular to the fold or lengthwise grain. Pin and cut. I mark the control notches for piece joining. By placing the marks, we not only mark the correct overlap of the patterns, but we also mark the right and wrong sides of the patterns. The cup pieces from neoprene or foam are cut off. I unpin the paper patterns from the lining pieces and place them on the remaining lace. The cutting principle of the lower cup is the same. However, the upper cup should be cut off from lace so that the scallops are positioned correctly. First, the scallops should be symmetrical, so I fold the fabric to ensure the scallops coincide and the edge is similar on both pieces. Second, I need to make sure that the lower edge of the scallops is at the level of the upper cut of the piece and is not in the seam allowance, as the scallops should be loose at the top. I cut off the upper lace pieces. My lace has very large scallops, and for beauty, I decide to add another scallop between them, which will be hand-stitched. I prepare 2 more scallops. We should not be in a hurry to unpin the paper patterns from the lace pieces, as it is impossible to mark on the lace. Thus, we have cut off all cup and corset body pieces and we are ready to start sewing.